Contrary to what a lot of people think, the Japanese katana is actually a fairly small sword for a two-hander. Even its predecessor, the tachi, which is a little bit longer, it has to be said, even these are not particularly long by, let's say, European standards. Where the Japanese katana tends to have a blade of about 27 to 29 inches long, it's not unusual for the earlier tachi to have a blade which reaches as long as 34 inches long. While European longswords like this, which fulfill a similar role to the katana and tachi, often have blades of 40 inches or even longer. Quite a bit bigger than the Japanese katana or tachi. So the question here is, why are Japanese swords relatively small compared to swords from lots of other parts of the world? And why didn't they make greater use of giant two-handed swords like this? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, in many videos we've discussed the fact that the Japanese katana, which people are relatively familiar with, is not actually a very long sword. I think a lot of people perceive it to be long because it has a two-handed grip, and perhaps on screen or in comic books or whatever, it looks like a long sword. But when we actually compare this to European and other Asian swords, Indian, Chinese, they're actually relatively short, despite the fact they're two-handed. And the thing that's notable is they are short for a two-handed sword. But not only that, they're also relatively short for a one-handed sword. Very often katana only have blades of 27, 28, 29 inches would be considered a long katana, and yet that is short by the standards of one-handed swords from lots of other places like China, India, or most of Europe. And sometimes people respond to this point, pointing out that the tachi, which is a type of sword which was worn earlier for quite a few centuries, the katana doesn't really appear until the 1400s. This had been around since the 900s, around 1000 AD, and reached this sort of form certainly by the sort of 12th, 13th century. So this was the sort of samurai sword before the katana came along, obviously worn in a different way, edge down rather than edge up, with different hilt fittings. And in fact these hilt fittings continued. The tachi didn't disappear when the katana came in, it continued in use, and in fact we sometimes find katana in what are called handachi mounts, which means essentially tachi-like mounts. But anyway, a lot of people point out that the tachi, the earlier tachi, tends to be longer. This isn't always the case. You certainly find some tachi which only have blades, even originally, if they haven't been suriage or cut down, even originally not really much longer than a katana. But it is fair to say that some tachi from some periods and some places do tend to be longer, but even then they're only usually up to about 33 or 34 inches in the blade, which is frankly not very long. That's shorter than lots of European one-handed swords. It would be a long Indian sword, not actually kind of average Indian sword. And indeed, if we compare with something like the European longsword, which often gets compared with the Japanese katana or tachi, these tend to have blades in excess of that. So usually a 33-inch blade, which would be long for a katana or a tachi, would be considered short for a European longsword. This, for example, has a nearly 40-inch blade, and there are plenty which are over 40 inches. Some are only 36 or 37, but as I say, they tend to be much bigger swords. And then, of course, some people point out the odachi or nodachi, or indeed the Chinese versions of it, which this is a sort of Ming Dynasty large two-handed sword of a type that was given to imperial bodyguards, particularly musketeers, so people who are operating firearms. We'll come back to that point a little bit later in the video. But people do point out that there are indeed giant Japanese swords, but they are really quite rare and they weren't used very much. They were used across the sort of feudal samurai period, but most famously perhaps in the 14th century. And these large two-handed swords, of which this is a Chinese version of that nodachi essentially, or field sword, really had quite limited use. So we're going to look at several points here for why is the Japanese sword, generally speaking, smaller than swords from lots of other places, at least in terms of the blade length. And then secondly, and wrapped into that, why didn't they make greater use of really bigger two-handed swords in Japan? So the first and absolutely probably most important point here is that the sword in Japan was a weapon, certainly the katana and the tachi, was the weapon of the samurai and was their secondary, sometimes even tertiary weapon. It wasn't their primary weapon, it was a backup that was worn. It was a sidearm. The primary weapon of the samurai varies by period, but it could be something like this yari, so a spear in other words, and there's various forms of yari, jumonji yari and various others. Or indeed a bow, okay? And the bow was probably the primary weapon until the Mongol invasions. Thereafter, they kind of changed their ethos slightly. But a bow or a yari, or indeed later on, a naginata. So essentially their primary weapons were forms of polearm or shafted weapon, or missile weapons such as the bow. And the katana or earlier tachi was really a backup weapon. And in fact, later on, even firearms are sometimes the primary weapon. But the point here is that if this is a backup sidearm, you want something that is, number one, comfortable and easy to wear. Now, the katana is worn through the sash, edge upwards, and really doesn't get in the way very much. Funnily enough, having a long hilt can actually get in the way, and for this reason certain types of troops wore a wakizashi instead of a katana. But if you're wearing a katana, having a relatively short blade and being tucked in up here, firstly means it's very easy to wear while you're using other weapons like a matchlock musket or using a yari or a bow, but secondly it means it's very quick to get out, and the Japanese were absolutely famous for this, so much so that what later became iaido, or essentially accessing and using the sword as quickly as possible, quick draw, as you would see in Akira Kurosawa movies, essentially was something that the Japanese specialised in. So having a shorter blade means you can get it out more quickly. And of course, while the katana was preferred for using on foot, earlier on when the samurai were more cavalry based, the tachi, which would have been worn on slings hanging down a bit like a European sabre, which means that when it's hanging down you can access the blade more easily because the sword is worn lower down, and that means that you can get a longer blade out. If we look at European rapiers, for example, they're worn very low down because you have to get an exceedingly long blade. If you're now wearing a sword high up here, you can't have a very long blade because then you wouldn't be able to access the sword and get it out of the saya or scabbard very easily. Now, another possible kind of origin reason for why Japanese swords tend to not be very long is purely to do with the accessibility to good steel. The way that the iron sand was produced into tamahagane, or the steel that they produced swords from, meant that Japan could never, or at least not until later on, couldn't produce large quantities of blades, or rather, it couldn't produce large quantities of long blades. In addition to that, the nature of the manufacturing with the tamahagane and the fact that you've got edge quenching going on means that it's not a spring blade and it doesn't have as much distal taper as most European or Indian or Middle Eastern swords would have, which means that you've got a fairly thick blade. It's very hard on the edge, relatively soft on the back, but it's a relatively thick blade. Now, if you've got an expensive amount of metal that takes a long time to produce into a good quality blade, producing very long blades is far more laborious, time-consuming and expensive. And moreover, if the nature of the structure and shape of the blade means that it's relatively heavy blade for its size, generally speaking, most people are not going to want very long blades because the blades will become too cumbersome and heavy. Now, whether we're looking at the katana or the tachi, therefore, we're producing a blade which is very time consuming to make, very relatively expensive for their economy to make. You can't make a lot of them and you can't make them quickly. And moreover, for their size, they're relatively heavy blades. That doesn't mean they cut well, and you can have a very hard edge on them and very sharp, but it does mean that generally speaking, you're not going to be wanting to make many very long blades. Obviously, they did make some, but most of them aren't going to be as long as places where there's more abundant steel, for example, in India or in Germany and Europe. Now, I strongly suspect that some of you watching this video already by this point will have shouted at the screen, it's because the Japanese are short. Well, first of all, there's a variation obviously in the Japanese population. In the modern world, Japan has about twice the population of the United Kingdom where I live, despite only being about the same surface area. So it was fairly populous. So there would have been a lot of variation. We do know there were some very tall Japanese, but equally, if we just look at averages, I have gone away and looked at this. It does turn out that in the, let's say, Muromachi period, for example, the average height of Japanese people, according to archaeology and records, seems to only be, this is men, okay, the average height of Japanese men in the Muromachi period seems to be between about 5'1" and about 5'5", so the average is there about 5'3". So it is quite short. Just for comparison, to give you something to go by, in the modern UK, the average height, where I live, the average height is 5'10". However, if we go back to the Anglo-Saxon period, it's about 5'8", so it's about 2 inches shorter. So if we stick in the similar to the Muromachi period, so we're talking, let's say, 15th, 16th century, the average height of British people at that time was about 5'6". So it is taller than the Japanese, but not hugely so, a few inches. It's not massively different. Moreover, height doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with how big the sword you use is. You can be short and use a great big long rapier, and you can be tall and use a gladius. Okay, so it doesn't always go hand in hand. So I do think it might be a bit of a factor, but maybe not as much as some people think. And of course, let's not forget that the Japanese did use giant great nodachi or odachi, massive swords like this, and of course they use naginata and yari of big sizes. So being short is really no constraint to using a massive sword. So now let's consider, why didn't the Japanese use massive swords more? Well, we've already considered the factors of the way that Japanese blades are formed and created and made, manufactured. And if they're using tamahagani steel, this is very valuable. They have less of it than some places in the world, as I mentioned. So first of all, the material limitations, but secondly, if you're making a blade a certain way, you end up with a blade that is relatively heavy for its size. Because it's edge quenched, you have to have a certain amount of thickness on the spine in order to maintain its rigidity and strength. Whereas in Europe, we were using, already by the 14th and 15th century, springed steel, which admittedly is not as hard at the edge as the Japanese swords with their water edge quenching. However, it does mean that you can make a blade which has distal taper and can be longer. It can be longer and more durable without bending or breaking, indeed. So, and they've got more steel as well. So quite easily, it's, or rather quite simply, it's easier to make more large blades in a place like India or Europe. Now, another point worth considering is the samurai spent quite a lot of their time on horseback. There were various points and places in Japan where in fact they fought more on foot. And there was a period, obviously, when the katana was brought in, that they seemed to have been fighting more on foot at that time, and that was probably one of the reasons for the switch from the tachi to the katana. But that being said, these massive two-handed swords are not very versatile. If this is your sword, you can't easily jump onto it. For a start, you can't easily wear it and ride a horse, but you can't easily jump onto a horse and use this one-handed on a horseback. Can you do it? Yes, you can do it. Can you use it two-handed? Yes, you can do. And equally, we know that they used naginata and yari two-handed on horseback. So you can do it without holding the reins. But it's a little bit hairy, and there's probably better weapons to use on horseback, such as the bow or the yari anyway. So this isn't a very versatile sword, and it's really specialised to using on foot. Now, another point to consider with these very big two-handed swords, and why wasn't the nodachi used more in samurai warfare, is bearing in mind that this would now become your primary weapon. Is it actually good for the job at hand? Well, it might be good for carving up enemy musketeers or archers or spearmen, for example. However, it's probably a pretty poor weapon for fighting in armour. So if you are a samurai coming up against other samurai in armour, this, I would argue, is not a very good weapon for that purpose. In armour, if you're using a sword, you often come very, very close and you end up grappling, using jiu-jitsu essentially. So if you've come in very, very close with a person, actually a sword that you can hold and wield in one hand is more useful to you in a number of ways. Firstly, because you might be grabbing, throwing, grappling with the opponent, and you can still use your sword primarily probably for thrusting, but obviously you can also cut with it if it's a sword that you can easily wield at close range in one hand, which you can do with a katana or even a tachi. Moreover, if you want to support the back of the blade in what we would call in European martial arts half swording, that can also be done quite easily with this type of sword. With a really big two-handed sword, it gets unwieldy because you're so close close to the opponent, you can't maneuver it around so easily. So essentially, in a close-in armoured fight, I would argue that this is useful for two main reasons. One, because it's shorter and more manoeuvrable, and secondly, because if you're using it in one hand while grabbing or wrapping, arm wrapping, or throwing or whatever with the other hand, then this is easier to use in one hand than a giant two-hander would be. TLDR, I would say that a katana is a better sword as a backup weapon in an armoured fight than the giant two-handed sword would be. And the final point to consider is, what do you gain from using a giant two-handed sword? They're really quite particular weapons for particular purposes. But it does mean that this becomes your primary weapon, with the exception of someone like the Imperial Ming Dynasty musketeers who used these swords in the Ming Dynasty. They've got a musket, they can only really carry one sidearm or hand weapon. They can't really carry a spear or a very long polearm very easily because they've got their muskets to manage and reload. Equally, they can't carry shields because a shield would be too cumbersome to carry with all of the other, the powder and the shot and everything else they need to carry to operate their muskets. Whereas something like this is a one standalone weapon that makes them more formidable than someone who's just got a single one-handed sword or a knife or something like that. So they're more formidable in hand-to-hand combat for having a two-handed sword. And in fact, we find Burgundian longbowmen also being told to carry two-handed swords in the 15th century in Europe. So it makes them more formidable than someone with a small hand weapon, but really not as effective as someone using a spear and a shield or a large polearm like a halberd or something like that instead. So it's something that they can carry that does increase their effectiveness in hand-to-hand combat. However, if you are a samurai, for example, or someone whose primary goal is hand-to-hand combat, then this isn't as good as a pole weapon, or not as good as a shield. So if we're in a medieval European context, if you don't have armour, then clearly a spear and a shield is the best thing to carry. That's what people carried for hundreds, even thousands of years. Or indeed in a Chinese or an Indian context as well. Shield and spear, pretty much normal equipment for the infantry. But if you could carry something even bigger than this, like a poleaxe or a naginata, that is going to be more effective than this, both against armour, and it's got greater reach against people with spears. And we've already argued that for most samurai expecting to fight other samurai, it's better to carry a naginata or yari or a bow and have one of these swords as a backup for close-in armoured close combat, rather than a big unwieldy sword which doesn't really confer you any great advantages fighting an armoured opponent. So we're left to ask the question, what are these for? Well, very much like European two-handed swords, they're specific weapons for a specific purpose. And I think there are only a few purposes in which these really big two-handed swords really excel. People who are designed to storm, essentially stormtroopers, to flood into kind of breaches in enemy fortifications or in enemy formations on the battlefield to cause complete chaos, or sometimes to hold a bridge or a doorway or an alleyway or a road or something like this in order to occupy space and keep people at bay, much like the famous axeman on the bridge at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. So these are kind of single hero weapons for someone who's not a typical knight or samurai fighting in armour and is not a typical infantryman. And in some cases, as we saw there with the Burgundian archers or the Chinese crossbowmen and musketeers, or indeed possibly sometimes in Japanese warfare as well, sometimes for a type of troop, a troop type who can't really carry the more conventional hand weapons, or rather you're trying to make them slightly more effective, but they're not able to carry something like a naginata, a glaive, a halberd, or something like this. So hopefully that's clarified a few things, or maybe it's as clear as mud. Post down in the comments, have I clarified anything for you? But this should answer hopefully some questions for why the katana was used, why the katana perhaps replaced the tachi in standard warfare for most soldiers, if not always. The tachi was still around. And moreover, why these are relatively short swords compared to certain other sword types in the world, why the Japanese might have preferred that or might have been restricted to that by the materials and other factors involved. And moreover, we've also looked at why giant two-handed swords which were available and it was possible to make them in Japan, why they were just never really very successful or very popular in Japanese warfare. So as always, I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and hopefully you're subscribed. Click that button if you're not, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks!
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!